Welcome to Not Entirely Unlike Tea with Christine Collins. Hey there, it's Christine Collins, and today I thought it would be fun and interesting for us to chat through the topic of clutter and decluttering, have a look at the psychology behind it, some of the neuroscience, and also a particular focus on neurodivergence and how that can factor into these challenges. Now, there are a lot of different things behind clutter and decluttering. And since I recently went through a decluttering process myself, which I try to do every so often, but I will transparently confess that this time around it has been just a little bit longer than usual. And as a result, there were a lot of spots in my living space that had gotten a little bit out of control, and largely due to focus around other things. And I know that this can be very common for people who have multiple competing priorities, perhaps family obligations and responsibilities, perhaps running a business or working really hard, perhaps health issues or similar personal distractions. But there are a number of other factors that can heavily contribute to things getting untidy and out of sorts. And once it reaches a certain level, it can become so overwhelming that the strong tendency that we have is to just continue to avoid the situation entirely. And it prompted me to investigate this a little bit more deeply. So I hope that this is useful and helpful for you as well. Now, some of the reasons why we may initially resist the decluttering process, even if we've had the keen observation that things are piling up, it's getting untidy, and we're unsatisfied with the situation, there are many factors that can delay tackling this issue. And we'll talk about it first from a more general standpoint, and then I'll get into a little bit more detail regarding neurodivergence. So one aspect of managing material objects surrounding you has to do with making decisions, and the resistance to do so can sometimes have to do with decision fatigue. So there are a lot of decisions that we have to make on an everyday basis, and sometimes when we're in a position where we're making a lot of decisions about other things in our lives, making decisions on the spot each day about what to do with a physical item can sometimes get postponed because of decision fatigue. So decluttering, if you're doing it kind of step by step on a daily basis, it requires making choices. A new item comes into the home and it's deciding where should this go. Now, if you have some well-worn pathways, for example, certain food items always go in a particular spot, perhaps in a pantry or somewhere in the refrigerator, or certain clothing items go in a particular spot in the closet, then it's a little bit easier. But when you are dealing with either a new item that does not fit into a previous category, or you've simply run out of real estate because you haven't gotten rid of older items that you're no longer using or no longer relevant, then it's a lot more difficult to find space and to make the time to put that new item in that space. And sometimes when we don't know what to do with that item, we'll just kind of stick it somewhere quickly, and that can become like a junk drawer or a little spot in the closet that's sort of filled with junk, or even a pile atop a nearby surface, or in some cases, a pile atop a pile. Doing that postpones having to make that decision to categorize the item or decide where it should live. And this happens more frequently when we're under any type of added stress, where lots of decisions are being made, and therefore the energy that we have available for decision making is decreased. And that can happen even more specifically with neurodivergence. There can also be issues with things not being visible, where we accidentally have repurchased the same item twice, we forgot that we had it already, or we forgot how we were using it, and that can also lead to behaviors of wanting to keep things more visible, handy, and easy to grab. In other cases, certain possessions can kind of reflect our sense of self, and so getting rid of some of those older items is kind of like a process of reassessing who you are now. But sometimes we might have an item that is connected to a happy memory, Perhaps something that we're holding on to because we're hoping that we'll do it again. Maybe it's related to a specific activity, like back when we used to go to yoga classes in person, and now we sort of do it at home, so we don't have quite as many different pairs of yoga pants and that sort of thing. There can also be an attachment for sentimental reasons to certain objects or items. Sometimes people save things like old birthday cards or a gift that was given to them by a deceased loved one. And of course, there's nothing wrong with holding on to some of those things. But the challenge in decluttering is removing some of the old materials if you are going to be continuously bringing in new things, whether it's new clothing or new household items or whatever it is. And another element here is that keeping a tidy space actually involves doing these things on a regular basis so that it doesn't pile up and build up over time to a point of where it's overwhelming. And so that requires time, it requires energy, and it requires that decision making. So there's a bit of a psychological barrier there. There's also sometimes a fear of waste or a concern that I might need this item again, I just don't know it now. And so we're reluctant to get rid of something, even if we haven't used it in a while, because we anticipate there might be a need for it in the future. And we think, well, if I get rid of it today, chances are next week will be the time that I end up needing that thing. However, there are many benefits to keeping up with decluttering and keeping things tidy. So on the one hand, there can be a tremendous sense of accomplishment at keeping things tidy or decluttering, and that can provide a mood boost and a sense of motivation. So the way that you feel about your physical space can heavily impact your psychological space. There's also a stress that's connected to having a lot of clutter piled up around you, so getting rid of some of that can actually reduce stress, because cluttered spaces can actually increase anxiety. And at a subconscious level, even if you are not notably paying attention to all of those items that are physically stacked up around you, at a subconscious level, your brain is processing visually all of those things, trying to take all of it in and make sense of it at all times. And therefore, you're using up energy processing visual data that you don't even need. So in that sense, clutter overloads the visual cortex, requiring additional mental energy in order to continue to process your surroundings. There's also a heavier load on the prefrontal cortex, whereas organized environments reduce the cognitive load there, improving decision-making and focus. When there's a lot of clutter, it increases the amount of brain energy being used. It can also activate the amygdala, which triggers a stress response, and so decluttering can help to lower cortisol and stress levels. And making those small daily decisions and putting things away into their place, kind of maintaining that organized space, may actually strengthen neural pathways that are associated with things like order and self-control, which can give you back more of a feeling of self-control if you've been feeling like there's a lot of things around you that are kind of larger than life and stressful. And it may help with focusing and concentration, because your brain doesn't have to use up energy to continuously process visually all of these details. Things are neat, organized, and in a place, and so you're not overwhelmed and feeling the stress of your physical environment. And it can help with memory, focus, reducing distractions as well. And when we have things in nice little categories, that visual processing, that visual cortex is experiencing kind of a decrease in mental fatigue, and the prefrontal cortex is better able to support decision-making, tackling all of the clutter, and making those little choices. Now, the prefrontal cortex is also responsible for executive functions, which is one of the factors in neurodivergence. So by not overwhelming it with all of the visual stimuli, it can help things just move more smoothly. And there are some ways that we can make this process a little bit easier for ourselves. So one thing that I like to do that is supported by neuroscience is having something fun happening for me in the background. And I do this whether I'm cleaning, decluttering, tidying up in general, like any type of physical activity. I like to either have on music, or I might be listening to a podcast or some type of auditory information. This kind of helps to keep my brain focused and distracted, because if there is any anything that's unpleasant in what I'm doing, like if I'm cleaning, then it allows me to have a little bit of pleasure, a little bit of dopamine release at the same time. Another thing I like to do that's supported by neuroscience is using some type of a reward of sensory details, such as aromatherapy. So one thing that I enjoy is after I'm finished cleaning or decluttering, I like to put on some aromatherapy, a nice scent. You could burn a candle, you could do something with sight, sound, sense, really any of the sensory details as almost like a reward system to recognize that because you've taken these steps of cleaning, decluttering, tidying, now your home feels like a nice space and you're going to dress it up even further with a nice scent or something similar. And that can also help you to build momentum, motivation, kind of keep the flow moving. It's also really important to celebrate small wins and to take things in small bite-sized pieces. So one of the reasons why tidying and decluttering can feel so utterly overwhelming is depending on the size of the space that you're looking at, whether it's large or small, if there are a lot of items to contend with, that can feel very disheartening to even get started because it just feels like a mountain that you can't climb. So making a conscious choice to do one small piece each day, maybe it just starts with a drawer. That's how I chose to start. And actually I was inspired by hearing that on a podcast. So I got the idea to just try one small space, get that under control, get that organized, and then go on from there the next day, try a different drawer or a different small space, do one countertop, do one small corner of one room. That helps to decrease your overwhelm, and also then you get the sense of accomplishment and reward for having completed that small goal, no matter how small it was. Now, another important piece as you're doing it is to develop systems that will work in the future. Now, I know for myself, I've struggled particularly with this because I am very changeable, very mercurial, and I do like to switch up how I do things every so often. So creating a system that works for me today may change quite a bit in a few months' time. But still, having a system of some kind gives you kind of a structure to follow that you can implement in each space so that you have some amount of consistency, like doing things by color coding or doing things by how things are used, if there's a particular drawer for this topic or that topic. And I would suggest going off of how your specific brain organizes material and information. While of course there are many systems out there that you can probably purchase or get advice around, it's actually not helpful if it doesn't make sense for you and the way that you operate. So it's helpful to first identify, this is how I use things. So for some people, it may be that they've got like workout clothes and then professional clothes and then sleeping clothes or something along those lines. However, if those categories are not your categories, it does not make sense to follow a system like that. So the way I do things is I have like grab and go the things that I use every single day. I have all of those things together in a very easy to reach space. And then different from that, I have pieces of clothing that I might use far more rarely. Maybe I only use once a month or every couple of months for a special occasion. And those are kind of pushed to the back so that I can easily reach the things that I need every day. And that works better for me than trying to divide up, like, this is this type of clothing or that type of clothing. So think about what actually works for you and design your organizational systems for those purposes instead. And now I want to focus on something that is very common that I see a lot of people talk about, and I certainly have experienced it for myself. And it is very much also connected to neurodivergence. And that is the concept of availability heuristic. And what that is tied to is the concept of out of sight, out of mind. And this is when we put things away. We store them nice and neatly. We put them in nice little boxes. We store them in the closet. We put them in drawers, and then we forget about them forever. And we can't even remember what's actually there. And as a result, we just bought batteries, but now we're rebuying batteries again because we forgot. So making sure that part of your system includes visibility to the extent that you specifically need it. And that may look different for different people. For myself, as I have gotten older, I have noticed that things that are not right in front of my face pretty consistently are just simply gone from my mind. That seems to be true with people, objects, experiences, memories. It isn't that I can't recall them. It's more so that they aren't present unless I specifically recall them or unless I am triggered to recall them in some way. So, for example, if I recognize that there's an item that I need to go and buy, it's really important that I go and open the drawers and check the closets first, because it is very likely that I won't remember having already purchased it, especially if it's small and tucked away neatly somewhere, or something that I don't use really often. So this notion of availability bias is pretty well established in cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology. And it's connected to having kind of a mental shortcut relying on an immediate example that's right in front of us if we're evaluating a topic or a concept or a decision. We tend to kind of weigh our judgments and our decisions towards whatever the most recent piece of information or visual information was, and we form new opinions and decisions based on the latest news or experience. So in this context of decluttering, this comes down to the out of sight, out of mind phenomenon where we just forget or even underutilize items that are not easily accessible or easily visible. Now, unfortunately, the tendency that we have to need to visually see those items in order to use them or to remember that we have them can lead to more clutter. And so this comes into play both in terms of the physical clutter that we're speaking about in terms of household items. It also comes into play with our electronic clutter. And I know that it's kind of an ongoing joke in the entrepreneurial communities of having a zillion open tabs. This is not an uncommon experience whatsoever. It's very common. And there are even tons of tools out there. So I use a tool called Toby, which has been recommended to me by some of my entrepreneurial colleagues, which I'm very grateful for and is incredibly useful. And there are other similar things that you can do to save your tabs and kind of record exactly which windows you have open on your devices. However, despite all of these amazing tools at our fingertips, we still keep our tabs open. And there is a psychological reason for that, and it's not at all unusual. It is partially connected to this need to have things that are clearly, easily visible at all times, because sometimes when we tuck those tabs away neatly, we actually do really forget what's there unless we have them all opened up again. And as a result, sometimes we might forget projects that we were working on or things that we wanted to explore. Because while most of us have a to-do list and some specific things that we're looking into, sometimes you just pop open a quick tab because you're shopping for a specific item or you're researching something specific, and it's not necessarily going to get written down in your journal of things to do for that day. And closing out all those tabs or saving them and hiding them can lead to a sense of forgetfulness about what that focus was. And it's not until you open the tab again and you say, oh yeah, I was looking into this, then you remember. So if you have experienced this hesitation that I'm describing about closing your tabs or putting away the physical items that you use regularly, there's nothing crazy about that whatsoever. It's actually very normal and very common. And particularly with neurodivergence and those of us who struggle with things like memory or brain fog, it can be quite useful to keep things visually available. And so I am here to tell you to stop shaming yourself if you're doing this. Instead of shaming yourself, think about a way that you could systemize how that works the best for you. So one of the things that I've done that's really helped me a lot is instead of completely putting everything away, if there are, say, 3 or 4 specific items that I just simply need to have out on the counter because I use them every day or I use them really often, and if they're tucked away, I know I'm going to be maybe a bit lazier about going to get them out or that sort of thing. So I just simply have a small container that contains just those 3 items, and it's see-through. So I can easily tell exactly what's in there so that when I'm looking for that one thing that I always need to grab, usually it's something like a tape measure or a chapstick or something like that, it's right there and I don't have to go hunting for it. You can do the same thing with your electronic tabs and just kind of decide what type of system works best for you and ignore any of the shaming or trash talking or minimizing that may be coming from outside sources, because only you know you and how your brain specifically organizes information. And most importantly, you know what leads you to success. So if you are finding that all of those open tabs are creating a problem for you, then by all means look into doing what you need to do to solve that. However, if it just works for you to consistently have 10, 15, however many tabs open at a given time, and you know exactly what's in those tabs and you go to those tabs really frequently, there's no reason to feel like you need to put those away. It can be also very helpful, as I mentioned, to use clear storage containers and other ways to keep things physically visual for you. It can also be helpful to do things like inventory checks periodically, to just have a look around and every so often go through your drawers. Every so often open the closet and peek around and see what all is in there. There may be some items that you've forgotten that you wanted to use. There may be something that you think you need to buy and you really don't. So maybe just once a month or something, just peek around at everything and have a look at what's there. Now, when it comes to neurodivergence, in particular ADHD, it can involve difficulties with executive functions, including organization and planning and management of both time and physical spaces. And those things combined can help to contribute to clutter kind of building up and compounding. There can also be an element of trouble with decision making. So we already talked through how much decision making is a really important piece in terms of keeping things tidy and decluttered. And so that can lead to further accumulation of stuff, because making those little daily, everyday decisions can be extra challenging. And on top of that, decluttering involves some amount of focus and just kind of staying with it. And finishing the task once you've gotten started can be a challenge as well. So understanding all of that, it can be helpful for us to do things like break those tasks down into smaller, more manageable pieces. Like we talked about, taking just one drawer, one corner, one little spot in one room, and then calling it done. And absolutely, most importantly, not feeling like a failure because you didn't do the whole house. Just make that the focus, that one drawer or corner. And then creating that system with whatever visual cues or reminders that work the best for you. Sometimes it can even be helpful to do like body doubling, or like I said, I listen to podcasts. It feels like there's someone there talking to me, and that helps me to focus. So if you need to get on a Zoom call on your cell phone with an entrepreneurial buddy or something like that while you're cleaning, that's an option that's available. It can also be helpful to tackle the smallest pieces first. So if you know there's something that's like an easy win, that if you tidy it up really quickly, you'll feel better and it'll be really easy, like 2 minutes, do that first, because sometimes getting that win, that little burst of dopamine, gives you some motivation to kind of keep coming back and doing more. It also really helps to have designated spaces for those everyday things that you use often, but deciding what actually works for you. So for some people, it may be having like their keys, wallet, and a cell phone charger all together in one little area. For someone else, it might be different items. But having things grouped that way can make it easier, because those are the things that you use the most often, and they're the most likely the things that you're going to lose that you'll need. And of course, you can do things like labeling and color coding and whatever forms or systems of organization that work the best for you. Working in short little sprints can be helpful too, 20 to 25 minutes at a time. Of course, I never do anything that way. If I'm getting started, I'm in this thing for a couple of hours or longer. And sometimes I get carried away and I'll just go all night until I'm finished. So not recommending that, but again, no self-shaming. If you know that that's what works for you and you're in a position where you can take a whole evening and do something like that, then I think that's totally fine. It's not about following someone else's recommendation. So one thing I learned about myself a long time ago was these little 25-minute Pomodoros don't work well for me. I need longer sprints, and that's not true for everybody. So really paying attention to yourself and noticing for yourself what works is so incredibly valuable. One of the reasons why those shorter sprints don't work for me is because it takes me a while to settle down and get focused. And once I do get into a project, I like to be hyper-focused in that project and really get something done. And that might take more like 90 minutes than 25. And then I'll take a break after I feel like I've accomplished something. So working simply for 20 minutes and then quitting in the middle doesn't feel right to me. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work for you. Lots and lots of people swear by their 25-minute Pomodoros. So absolutely, if that's the system that works for you, by all means, use that. And of course, there's lots of apps and tools and support and resources for organizational systems. So definitely feel free to research and look into some of the resources that may be available to you. Now, another element that can be very helpful here is mindfulness and meditation and using tools that support your brain and the neuroplasticity of building those new neural pathways for whatever your goal or desired outcome is. Of course, I talk really frequently about hypnosis because that is one that I'm very familiar with, and because I have a hypnosis membership, but there may be other tools that work for you as well. Practicing playing around with different tools and resources to see what actually supports you the best. Supporting yourself as well with good nutrition, adequate sleep can go a long way with supporting brain functioning, organizational capacity, ability to make decisions. Of course, when we're tired, it's much more difficult to make decisions at all, let alone good decisions. So making sure that you're practicing self-care, you're taking good care of yourself, of your brain and your body, so that you can create the environment and the space around you, which, by the way, then gives back to you in terms of uplifting your mood and supporting your mindset. Because when we're in a nice, tidy, decluttered space, it's easier to focus. We have that executive functioning working a little bit better for us on our behalf. And so it's kind of like a cyclical process. Now, if you're looking specifically for mindset tools like hypnosis, yoga nidra, visualization practice, and mini meditations, I do have a hypnosis membership called the Hypno-Pothecary, and all of the details about that are in the very bottom of the show notes in case you would like to check it out. There is a special offer for podcast listeners, so have a look at that, and I hope that you have found this to be useful to you and very helpful. And until we connect the next time, I wish you the most magical and creative rest of your day. Thanks for listening. This is Christine Collins at transformcreate.com.